Tonight we have the distinct pleasure of addressing one of the top 6 global issues leading up to the 2012 elections. And this was agreed upon by all of the 92 chapters of the World Affairs Council across America. This issue is U.S. energy policy and energy security. Leading our discussion tonight is one of our country's foremost experts on the topic, and we welcome to Hampton Roads and Virginia Beach Miss Korin. Not yet. As you know, the World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization dedicated to educating, inspiring, and engaging Americans in international affairs and the critical global issues of our times, and of which this is certainly one, and to promote a greater understanding and interest in matters of international relations, foreign policy, and diplomacy. Our goals are to inform and educate the Hampton Roads community, in our case, based on the belief that a well-informed public is essential to the conduct of our foreign policy. I want to welcome our students here from Tallwood High School and our many local colleges and universities. You are our future, and tonight's issue is going to be very vital to that future. So this is very appropriate. With rising oil and gas prices, energy obviously comes back in the news again, and especially in the transportation sector. The strategic importance of oil and our dependence on foreign oil has our attention again, and it is a very politically charged issue. It's very much in the news. You only had to read the news this week to see more and more articles, and in fact this morning on the morning talk shows, that's all they were talking about was energy, alternative energy, natural gas, biofuel, oil, gasoline, and that's in the news. We see a push towards more domestic drilling to increase our supply as one alternative, and at the same time, development, especially by our military, and those of us associated with the military here know about this, alternative biofuels, meant to eventually reduce this dependence. And as I said before, earlier last year, the Blue Angels flew a whole air show on biofuels. It was a 50-50 mix of jet fuel and biofuels. And here in just a few weeks, the Navy is going to demonstrate a whole strike group that was run on 50-50 mix of diesel fuel and biofuel, including all the aircraft off the USS Nimitz. So those things are being developed. Well, what should our policy be? Where is all this leading? And here today to help us understand this issue is Ms. Korin, whose biography is contained in your program. She's co-director of the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security. She's an advisor to the United States Energy Security Council and chairs the Set America Free Coalition, an alliance promoting ways to reduce America's dependence on foreign oil. She also chairs the Mobility Choice for a Secure America Coalition, an alliance promoting fiscally responsible, free market-oriented approach to expanding competition among transportation modes. She frequently appears in the media and on Capitol Hill, along with my good friend James Woolsey, former CIA director. We were in the same company together at Booz Allen for a while and served together. And her advice is sought by members of Congress. She has spoken to numerous additional World Affairs Councils, and they have all called me with their strong recommendations. And she's spoken to many conferences and institutions and universities nationwide. She's a prominent author of many articles, and the book Turning Oil into Salt, Energy Independence Through Fuel Choice, which I just finished reading last night, and I recommend this to everyone here. To understand this issue, you really need to read that book. It's extremely eye-opening, and I recommend it to us all. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Korin.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We're going to talk about oil today, but before we talk about oil, I'm going to talk to you about salt. Because understanding salt is really key to vividly picturing the issue that we're facing with respect to oil. And it's an issue that seems obvious, but it's often misunderstood. So let's start with salt. Salt was once a strategic commodity. It was a strategic commodity because it was the only way to preserve food. And so it really shaped the course of history. It determined the stature of countries on the world stage. Wars were fought over salt. Are you high school students? Have you learned the history of salt yet? If you haven't, you probably will. It was a fundamental force in shaping our world. And what happened is, one day Napoleon had enough. And he set a prize of 12,000 francs for whomever could make salt irrelevant, because he wanted to march his army far, and you know, armies march on their stomach. Then you need to preserve a lot of food to march hundreds and thousands of miles. So it took 12 years, and a French chef developed the earliest form of canning, which was preserving food in bottles, and then came canning as we know it, and later on, and much more importantly, came electricity, and with it, refrigeration. What's the bottom line? We consume more salt than we ever did before. Hardly any of it is for food, really. It's mostly for snow clearing. But does anybody here know who the world's biggest salt reserve holders are? Do you know how much salt we import? Do you think about what world salt price is? Do you care? This is the point. This is what energy independence means. Okay? This is what energy independence means. Energy independence doesn't mean walling ourselves off from the world market. It doesn't mean ending imports. It means making oil just not that important anymore, making it not a strategic commodity, making it something that's bought and sold and useful for a range of purposes. But nobody really thinks about it when considering foreign policy or when worrying about price spikes that will bring our economy to its knees. All right, so why is oil a strategic commodity? And here's something that's very often also misunderstood. Today, only 1% of US electricity is generated from oil. Let me say that again. Only 1% of US electricity is generated from oil today, and only 1% of US oil demand is due to electricity generation. Do you understand what that means? That means that you can build as many nuclear power plants, solar panels, wind turbines as you want. It will not impact oil at all. Understand? This is something that's very important to grasp. Oil status as a strategic commodity derives from its virtual monopoly over transportation fuel. 97–98% of transportation energy is petroleum-based. And transportation is the undergirder of the global economy, right? There wouldn't be such a thing as a global economy as we know it if not for transportation. And there wouldn't be transportation as we know it if not for oil. That is why oil is so important. Because it brooks no competition in the transportation fuel sector. Okay, so put that aside for one moment. Now, when we listen to the political rhetoric, the prevailing rhetoric over many, many years has been, well, we're very dependent on oil, we're too dependent on foreign oil, and so we need to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. And then on the right you get, let's drill, baby, drill. And on the left you get, let's use less through fuel efficiency standards. Among pundits you sometimes get, let's tax gasoline, tax oil. How do these policy prescriptions play out in the real world? Firstly, there's nothing wrong with drilling. Some people may have environmental issues with it, but on an economic basis, there's nothing wrong with drilling. It's one of the few bright spots in our economy today. In fact, the U.S. is experiencing an oil boomlet, if you will. And on the other side of the ledger, efficiency is also a good thing. It's good to stretch each gallon of fuel, get more bang for your buck. But this doesn't really address the core issue. We're facing an energy security paradox. Here's what you need to understand on this front. 7 years ago, we imported 60% of our oil. Today, we import 45% of our oil. Okay? Our import level has dropped, not just in these relative terms, but also in absolute terms. We import less now than we did 7 years ago. But we are paying more for those imports. Not just more per barrel, but more for that overall amount of imports. So we've become more self-sufficient, we've become more fuel efficient, but we're spending a lot more on oil imports than before. So that's the energy security paradox of the 21st century. And that should be a wake-up call to everybody that the traditional paradigm, the traditional way of thinking about this issue is a failure. And we need to understand why that is. The reason this is so is as follows. 79% of world conventional oil reserves are controlled by OPEC, the oil cartel. If you kids don't know what OPEC is, then your homework assignment, seriously, this is important stuff, is to read up on OPEC. 79% of world conventional oil reserves are controlled by OPEC, and yet OPEC accounts for only 36% of global oil supply. Okay, now think about that. If it wasn't sovereign regimes, but rather Exxon and Chevron and BP and Shell and other investor-owned companies that were sitting on top of 79% of conventional reserves, do you think they'd be only at a third of world supply? No. They'd be at 68% or 82%. Because if they'd only be at a third of world supply, they'd be facing antitrust action. Right? But you can't bring an antitrust case against sovereign regimes. So what has happened over the past numerous decades is the global economy has grown. Many, many people have risen out of poverty in the developing world, and that's a very good thing. And with that rise out of poverty has come increasing demand for energy, and among the array of energy sources for which demand has increased, of course, for transportation energy also, and that's oil. So the global economy has grown, global oil consumption has grown, non-OPEC production has grown very much by leaps and bounds. OPEC is producing just a teeny little bit more than it was some 30 years ago. That's the issue that we're facing. And when we drill more, what can the cartel do in response? To bring back the supply-demand relationship to its tightness. Exactly. When we drill more, the cartel can drill less. In fact, they don't actually really even have to do that because there's all this demand coming in from the developing world that's sucking up whatever additional capacity we put out there. So the cartel can just sit on its hands and it achieves the same thing. But it's helpful to understand it, take the developing world out of your mind a minute and think about it in the abstract. It helps to understand the dynamic. Now, efficiency is exactly the same thing as drilling in that respect. Because when we use less, what can the cartel do in response? We use less, they produce less. Exactly. We use less, they drill less. We drill more, they drill less. We use less, they drill less. That's the issue. As long as we're playing on the playing field that OPEC dominates, we cannot win. And here's one other thing to keep in mind. You know who's the 6th largest oil-consuming country in the world? Saudi Arabia. We think OPEC is producing and producing and producing, and it's just going to keep on producing. Well, lots and lots of people live in OPEC countries, and the population is growing. And if you look specifically at the Gulf area, and you think what has happened post-Arab Spring, then what you realize is, for example, the Saudi regime doesn't want to end up like Mubarak. So how have they decided to avoid the fate of Mubarak? And this is something that we see throughout the Gulf. Well, increase spending, increase payment to government workers, increase subsidies, increase grants to the population, pay their subjects off so they don't storm the palaces and remove their heads from their shoulders. And what that means is, because the income coming into these regimes is oil and sometimes gas income, what that means is that the break-even price for oil has gone up. And it's going up year to year. The break-even price of oil has gone up. Growing population, increasing social spending, bloated budgets. In order to try and maintain stability, break-even price of oil has gone up. That means the price of oil that we face, that the rest of the world face, that everybody faces, has gone up. And here's another thing to understand. When we think about the price of oil, some people harbor the delusion, and I understand it because, wouldn't it be nice if it were the case? But some people harbor the delusion that if we were only self-sufficient with respect to oil, or if we only just, drilled enough and reduced our imports so we were only importing oil from Canada and Mexico, because the fact is, never have our imports from the Persian Gulf exceeded 15%. Most of our oil imports come from Canada and Mexico. Okay, it doesn't matter because it's a global oil market, and here's where we get back to why it doesn't matter and it wouldn't help reduce the price of oil if we were self-sufficient. Because it is a global market with a global price. Think of the oil market as a swimming pool. Producers pour oil in, consumers take oil out. We don't buy a drop from Iran. Anything that happens to affect supply from Iran affects everybody, not just us. When there was a supply disruption for Libyan oil, that affected everybody, not just Libya's direct customers. In 2008, when oil hit $147 a barrel, the United Kingdom was almost self-sufficient with respect to oil because of the North Sea. You may remember watching in the news truckers protesting fuel prices in the United Kingdom then. Because it's a global price. It's the same price for everybody. That's not to say we shouldn't drill. But it is to say we need to understand drilling more is just like expanding any other industry. Okay, it's good for the economy and so forth. But it doesn't impact oil's strategic status. It won't help us keep the price of oil lower, unfortunately, because we're dealing with a cartel. Okay, so oil has a monopoly over transportation fuel. That monopoly is married to a cartel. Well, all this is very bad news. And, I don't want to leave you completely depressed. So now we're going to talk about what we can do about it. Because we can do something about it. We can do something about it. And that's what we need to understand. And this should be a cause for optimism, while at the same time, I'm sure it will be for you a cause of great frustration, because when you understand what we can do about it, then the question is, why haven't we done it? Okay, so first the framework. In order to reduce the strategic importance of oil, we need to break its monopoly over transportation fuel. That means we need to put it needs to be in competition with other fuels on the vehicle. That means you can choose on the fly how to power your car, depending on the comparative price of different fuels. Right? Then no one fuel has any inordinate importance. So essentially, we want to be able to arbitrage among energy commodities when it comes to transportation fuel. Okay? To do that, cars need to enable fuel competition. If your car doesn't enable fuel competition, it doesn't matter how economic competing fuels are. You still won't use them. Let's give an example here. Let's say that you are allergic to soy milk and to rice milk, but you have to start every day with a cup of coffee with some milk in it. Cow milk could go to $30 a gallon. Could you put soy milk or rice milk in your coffee? No. You could use less cow milk, right? You could maybe make do without, but you couldn't switch to something else. And the situation we're facing today is essentially our cars are allergic to everything else. Our cars are allergic to everything other than petroleum fuels. So how do we change that? Let's talk about what we can do in terms of the technologies that are available today and the policies, if any, that would be helpful in making them happen. So firstly, I'm sure everybody who's been reading the news is aware of the fact that natural gas prices are unusually low. And that's because there's been a real revolution in terms of the technology of exploring for unconventional gas, exploring and extracting unconventional gas. So natural gas prices are extremely low. Now, the energy content of a barrel of oil as compared to a million BTU of let's drop the technical jargon. The energy content of oil as compared to natural gas, there's a 1-to-6 ratio there. And because of the price disparity between oil and natural gas has widened to 1-to-20. So that means that natural gas is way, way, way cheaper per energy unit. For the amount of energy it contains, it's way, way cheaper than oil for the same amount of energy. Okay? So how do we use this natural gas in our cars? I'm not saying natural gas is the only thing we should focus on. I'm going to use natural gas as an example here because natural gas will walk us through many different technologies as we think about what we can do with natural gas. So the first thing we can do with natural gas is use it to generate electricity. And then use that electricity to power plug-in hybrid or electric vehicles. Right? Plug-in hybrids are like souped-up hybrids with a bigger battery and a plug, so your 20, 30 miles of driving, local driving, you can do on electricity from the grid, and the rest of your driving is done on the liquid fuel in your tank. Well, this is an excellent technology. It's expensive. It's going to take time for battery costs to come down. It's going to take time for this technology to penetrate the mass market. It's going to take a lot of time. It doesn't mean we shouldn't move in that direction when we can. If you have extra money in your pocket and then you're in the market for a car, then pull the technology forward, buy yourself a plug-in hybrid or an electric vehicle. Okay, but if you think about mass market cars, you know, $15,000 to $20,000 cars, it's going to take a while. Second thing you can do with natural gas, you can compress it. You can use it as compressed natural gas or CNG in a CNG vehicle. And that's fine, and the fuel is very cheap. But the problem is that on the vehicle side, it's very, very expensive. We're talking around a $10,000 price difference. I think the Honda Civic natural gas is $8,600 more expensive than the Honda Civic gasoline model. Okay? In Pakistan or Bangladesh, it's a lot less expensive, but the reason it's a lot less expensive is that the safety standards are much less stringent. So the type of canisters we use to store the gas in the US are much higher grade. And that's not going to change because we're not going to tolerate unsafe vehicles, right? So there's a trade-off there. You want to keep the safety, it's going to be expensive. And the price will come down, but it's not going to come down very, very low. It's still going to be very expensive. And just to illustrate, even if we were talking about a $5,000 price difference, let's say your car gets 20 miles per gallon, and let's say on an energy equivalent basis there's a $2 difference between gasoline and natural gas. And let's say there's a $5,000 price premium for the car, not $10,000, but let's call it $5,000 to kind of be optimistic. It would take you 50,000 miles to pay off that added car cost. That's a lot of miles. So unless you're a heavy, heavy fleet user, that's a tough, tough economic case to make. All right, well, it's not so promising so far. What's the third thing you can do with natural gas? You can convert it to a liquid fuel called methanol. Now, methanol sounds like ethanol, but it's something different. They're both alcohol fuels. Ethanol you can drink, methanol you cannot. But they're both alcohol fuels, and they both can run in flex fuel vehicles. And flex fuel vehicles are vehicles that, of course, can use gasoline. They're vehicles that have a liquid fuel tank. Now note, in the US, flex fuel vehicles are only warranted to use gasoline and ethanol. I'm talking about what's technically possible, not what's available on the market in the US now. Flex fuel vehicles can use gasoline, ethanol, methanol. Methanol is the most corrosive of alcohols, so that really opens the car to a whole plethora of alcohols and ethers, and gasoline, of course. Opens the car to a very broad choice. And it costs under $100 extra to make a car flex fuel. This is not theoretical. We know what the cost is. By 2008, 90% of new cars sold in Brazil were flex fuel. People think Brazil, they think sugarcane ethanol, but the fact is that the flex fuel cars in Brazil can run on MEG, methanol, ethanol, gasoline. And that's every automaker that sells cars in the US. You ask Toyota, the cars they're selling in Brazil, can they use alcohol? And they say, yes. Then you ask GM, let's go to China for a moment. Because China has drastically expanded its methanol industry because it has a lot of cheap inland coal. Cheap because it's trapped inland with no good transportation to get it out. Because in today's market in many parts of the world, coal is actually more expensive than natural gas. But anyway, China has drastically expanded its methanol production. It's demarked methanol as a strategic transportation fuel. And you ask GM, the cars you're selling in China, the cars you're going to put on the road in China, are they going to be able to run on methanol? And they'll tell you, yes, because China and the US are equally important markets for GM. So China's going to have fuel choice. Brazil has fuel choice. Other countries are going to have fuel choice. We, so far, are not going to have fuel choice. And we are not going to have fuel competition. Now, I'm focusing on methanol as one example, on natural gas as one example. This is not the only example. I just want us to understand what's possible as an illustration. What are the economics? This is the question you always have to ask yourself when somebody talks about a fuel or technology. What are the economics? When you think about the economics of methanol, for example, the function of the price of natural gas versus the price of oil is exactly what you're seeing when you're looking at the price of methanol versus the price of gasoline. So, today gas is under $2.50. I don't think it's going to stay so low. But let's say it's $6 gas. It's $6 gas, it's 72 cents a gallon to make methanol. Methanol has about half the energy of gasoline. So you have to take 2 gallons of methanol equals 1 gallon of gasoline. You have to consider there's a markup all the way along the supply chain. There's a markup to wholesale. The spot market in Houston, methanol hovers between $1 and $1.15 a gallon. So let's look at that, not at the production cost. Double that. Let's average between $1 and $1.15, and to make the math simple, let's call it $1.10. Double that, you have $2.20. You have to add the cost of distribution, you have to add taxes, you have to add a retail markup, and still, when you compare apples to apples, so on the same energy content of the fuel, you're doing a lot better than you are with gasoline for a very broad range of oil and natural gas prices. That means oil could go all the way down to $45 a barrel. And natural gas could probably go all the way up to around $7, because the main cost in gasoline is oil and the main cost in methanol is natural gas. So you could have oil all the way down to 45, natural gas all the way up to 7, and you're still doing better with methanol. Why is that important to understand? It's important to understand because when you think about what makes investors expand capacity in a particular fuel, one of the things they're doing is they're looking at the market and saying, well, where do I expect oil price to go? Where do I expect my feedstock to go? For how broad a range of the prices of both of these things am I going to be economic? So there's a lot of certainty when you look at that. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, so what's the issue here? And then you realize, well, why on earth would you build hundreds upon hundreds of natural gas to methanol plants if our cars can't use the fuel? And so what we need to do is we need to open up our market to competition. And we need to open up our market to competition in this way. We need to open up our cars to competition. And we need to tell the auto industry, look, we don't care how you do it. We don't care which technology you use. You want to electrify vehicles? Fine. You want to do CNG? Fine. You want to do liquid fuel choice? Fine. If you do liquid fuel choice, not enough to do gasoline, ethanol. We want gasoline, ethanol, methanol, because we want the broadest range of choice here. Full competition. So fuels made from agricultural material, from natural gas, from coal, perhaps in the future from recycled carbon dioxide, can all compete. We don't care which technology you use, but you need to open your cars to fuel competition. Because if you don't, what you are implicitly doing, and we know you're not doing it on purpose, and we know it's not any bizarre conspiracy, we know it's just inertia, but what you're implicitly doing is colluding with a cartel. And since this is not a normal cartel comprised of companies, and we don't have the policy option of bringing an antitrust lawsuit against them. And since, look, it's almost now 11 years after 9/11. I don't think I need to tell anybody. I don't need to get into the details of the link between oil and the national security vulnerabilities that we face. If it's not clear at this point, there's nothing I can say that will make it clear to people. But we need to tell the auto industry, everybody gets this link. A, the fact that the oil market is dominated by a cartel has profound economic implications for this country. Because every time oil price spikes, we don't know why, economists don't understand exactly why, but what is known is every time oil price spikes, economy goes into a downturn. And a second spike now, in the current fragile state of our economy, is like a second heart attack to somebody that's just recovering from one. It's a terrible thing. So we need to tell the auto industry, Congress needs to tell the auto industry, open your cars to fuel competition. We need an open fuel standard that says new cars need to allow fuel competition. Do it any way you want, but you need to do it. When you buy a car today, it's on the road in the US for over 16 years. That's how long it takes to turn over the fleet. That means that every day, every week, every year that we wait is another day, week, year, 16 years down the road that we're going to be stuck with cars that are wedded to a commodity that is monopolized by a cartel comprised of countries that do not wish us well. There's a lot more that we can talk about, but I'm going to end on this point so we can have a vigorous discussion and questions, assuming you have questions. What I want to leave you with is that we are talking about something very simple here. If you think about liquid fuel choice, under $100 a car. It took Brazil 3 years to go from 0 to 70% of its new cars being flex fuel. We're not talking about a technology that needs to be invented. We're talking about the folks in Washington needing to get their heads together and decide to do something that doesn't benefit any one industry over the other and doesn't subsidize anybody, but creates an open and competitive market for transportation fuel so that we can turn oil into salt. Thank you, and I'm glad to take questions.
Well, Ms. Korin, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation, and it really is a lot of food for thought. I think all of us, and I think there's probably some really good questions here too. So Ms. Korin has certainly agreed to answer our questions because she's very familiar with World Affairs Council. So if you have one, please use the microphone up here if you can, and so everybody can hear what the question is, and remember to talk into it so everybody can hear. And if you haven't noticed already, the presentation is being filmed for public access television, but also I hear that the World Affairs Council can get a copy of this. We may have it posted on our website soon. So with that, I know Maz has one, so come on. And just please line up here and we'll get it started.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm Dr. Mario Mazzarella. I'm a member of the World Affairs Council Board. Okay, I'm going to be a pain in the neck. I am the chairman of the board of King Motors. I make a lot of money in this country selling cars, a particular kind of technology. You come along and tell me I have to change my damn technology. This is going to cost me money. Young lady, you're going to cost jobs. You're going to raise my price of my product. You're an enemy here, and I've got enough money to shove it into political campaigns to make sure that what you want isn't going to happen. Is this a totally fictitious scenario? Or just in the stretch of the imagination, could this possibly happen? And what do we do about, is this not where the problem lies?
That is where the problem lies, yes. The problem lies with the auto industry saying, we don't want government to tell us what to do, and you know what? Normally, they're right. Right? Normally, for most things, they would be right. It's generally not a very good thing when government tells industry what to do. In this case, I was just reviewing The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek yesterday on your reading list, okay? And you will note, and not just Hayek, but Milton Friedman as well, speak of monopolies, cartels, as profound dangers. And Hayek, I'll put it in my, well, not in my own words, in Orwell's words, the message he very strongly sends is do not adopt a 4 legs good, 2 legs bad mentality when thinking about policy. What that means is, yes, we want an open and competitive market without government interference. However, sometimes we do need government to play a role. In the case of monopolies, in the case where the market faces an aberration that it cannot overcome on its own, then there is room for policy. And let's talk specifically about why I think the auto industry is wrong. A, wrong that it's not doing this voluntarily, but also wrong to oppose an open fuel standard. In a good economic year, the auto industry, foreign and domestic automakers, sell in the US over 16 million cars. That's a good year. In a bad economic year, they sell around 10 million cars. You know what one of the big differences between a good economic year and a bad economic year is? The price of oil. So if you're an auto executive, you want to move to a world in which you can sell lots of more cars. So it's in your interest, I think, to reduce the strategic importance of oil, to put it into competition with other commodities, because what will happen if you do that, that'll drive capacity expansion among competing fuels. Okay? And when you have capacity expansion, not overnight, but eventually, when the capacity expands sufficiently, you're going to have competition over market share for the transportation fuel sector. And when you have competition over market share among substitutable products, what is that competition waged over? Price. That's right. Competition over market share for transportation fuel will drag down the price of oil. And it'll drag it down, not overnight, but eventually it'll drag it down to the level at which the highest cost competitors are economic and profitable. So to say $45 to $50 a barrel as an equilibrium price level. So if you're an auto executive, you should want to live in that world. And you should think, well, it's under $100 a car. You know, when somebody's buying even a $15,000 car, do you say, I'll buy it for $15,000, but $15,100, that just kills it for me? No, right? You don't. Otherwise, we'd have cars without cup holders. Okay, we don't have cars without cup holders. That is proof that people aren't price sensitive to that degree when they're buying new cars. I hope that answers the question. But what we can do about it, I strongly believe that the most powerful lobby in the world is the lobby of the American people. And what that means is very simple, okay? So you all are here, you all are listening, maybe you agree, I hope so. But you have a choice when you get home. You could say, well, that was interesting. I spent a pleasant evening with my friends, heard some interesting stuff. Okay, it's like you went to the ballet or something. Or you could say, you know what, this is really important. And we're in election season, which means that our representatives in Washington are particularly attentive to our thoughts and our priorities, and you could let them know that this is important to you.
I had to walk a long way to get up here, so I'd like to ask a couple of questions since I'm here. One, you talked about Brazil and the fact that it went from your multiple-use fuel vehicles from 0 to 70%. What happened to the petroleum usage during that same time period? The second question is, under your scenario where you talk about the potential for the production of oil dropping to like $45, $50 a barrel, some of the oil that we're producing now, like the fracking, like up in North Dakota, it's only possible because the price of the oil is over $100 a barrel. So what would be the impact of oil fields like that and the employment and the economy if that were to happen, if the oil price were driven down on the order of $50 a barrel?
Very good questions, both. Firstly, what happened in Brazil? Firstly, to understand what happened in Brazil, we have to go back many years, because the beginning of the policy shift in Brazil actually happened during the military dictatorship, and then it wasn't a shift to fuel choice. Two things happened at that point. After the Arab oil embargo, Brazil felt very vulnerable. And so the two things they did, one, drastically expanded oil exploration and production, offshore production. Now it's began to pay dividends for them. And two is drastically expand their sugarcane ethanol industry. Now, cars, automakers, go back 30 years now, over 30 years. Automakers selling cars in Brazil at that point understood that what Brazil wanted was a shift from 100% gasoline cars to 100% alcohol cars. Not talking choice here. Okay? And people loved those cars. That was great for quite a while. But then something happened. Sugar price went up, oil price went down, and people said, we're stuck with these cars and we have to use something that's more expensive, because ethanol in Brazil is made from sugar. When gasoline made from oil is so cheap, we don't like this. Just in the nick of time came flex fuel technology. And then the Brazilians understood that it's all about the market. It's not about the government saying, you know, Soviet-style central planning, this is the fuel or this is the fuel mix, or we know what is the optimal mix of fuel. No. We put 1,000 of the smartest people you want together of any profession. They will not be able to figure that out. It's too complicated. There are too many factors. But the market on its own can figure it out. If the cars let you choose, make a dynamic choice every time you fill up. So, flex fuel vehicles. As Brazil's flex fuel fleet expanded, We hit 2008, 90% of new cars in Brazil are flex fuel. Oil price has spiked. We're at $147 oil. Prices of gasoline at the pump are high. Brazilians look at gasoline, they look at alcohol, and they say, you know what? On a per mile basis, it's less expensive to fuel with alcohol. So in 2008, gasoline became an alternative fuel in Brazil. They used more alcohol than they did gasoline. Now, sugar prices could spike again, oil prices could plummet. That'll change. Having a competitive market doesn't determine who wins. It just means no one player, no one commodity, no one fuel is important. So to answer your question, it depended on the year, on the comparative price of alcohol and gasoline, of sugar and oil. It depended what happened to oil consumption there, because people made a different choice depending on the comparative price. Now, your second point, also a good one, looking at the unconventional oil resources in the US, some of the resources elsewhere in Canada. Look, it's $1.50 a barrel to lift oil in Saudi Arabia. It's $1.50 a barrel. When you're getting to unconventional oil, whether we're talking about tar sands like in Alberta in Canada, or even much, much more difficult oil shale, we're essentially talking about rock, then the price goes higher and higher and higher. So the question is, well, if oil drops to $45 to $50 a barrel, your question is, well, what's going to happen to all of this unconventional oil activity in the US? First of all, the unconventional activity in the US is unconventional gas, unconventional oil, and in some cases a mix of the two. So the unconventional gas story, like we said, I mean, it's going to be competitive even at $45 oil. In fact, it'll probably be in better shape, not because of the $45 oil, but because what it will take to bring oil down to $45 in terms of market competition is a drastic expansion of productions of fuels made from that gas and from other feedstocks, which means lots of demand for that gas, which means the price of gas will be higher than it is today, which will be good for the industry and much more economically sustainable and so forth. But there's no question that some resources will come off the table. But I think it's kind of like yin and yang. Some resources will come off the table because they won't be economic, but that will be because other resources are facing a much, much larger demand. And in largely the same sector. And the other thing, that's when you look particularly at people working in the oil and gas industry. The other thing is, if you look at the economy writ large, then the economy as a whole will be much, much healthier with lower oil prices, because the rate at which we are bleeding wealth right now is absolutely tremendous. So oil going down lower would have a profound impact on the amount of dollars that can stay in the US, be invested in the US, be spent in the US, creating jobs with every one of those actions, kind of trickling down. Right now, our oil dollars are stimulating the Persian Gulf and Venezuela, and even though we're not importing very much oil from any one of these places, like I said, mostly from Canada and Mexico, but it's a global market, so our oil dollars are stimulating the exporters. Any other questions? Did I wear you all out? That's it?
Good evening. My name is Dan Wozniak. I'm with the World Affairs Council. I'm an intern with them and also a graduate student at Old Dominion University in the International Studies program. You mentioned that for new vehicles, it would cost about $100 to make them flex fuel capable. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on what options might exist for flex fuel conversion in existing petroleum-only vehicles.
So for the aftermarket, for retrofitting older cars, firstly, while there are kits for conversion to gasoline ethanol flexibility, you can't buy off the shelf a gasoline ethanol methanol kit. That's not because it's a lot more complex, it's because you don't have fuel at the stations. And I think those kits for ethanol, gasoline ethanol flexibility are around $300 or $400, something like that. They're kind of plug-and-play kits. But I think, you know, if you start with your question and you take it further, then what you have to ask is, what would it take for us to see lots of cars, old cars, being retrofitted to be fuel flexible, right? That's the real question here. And we kind of have to understand how the market would react to different things. So let's say we have an open fuel standard in place, so new cars rolling onto the roads have to allow fuel competition. Now, we know that most likely the automakers will choose the least cost option, which is liquid fuel choice, right? At this point. Okay, a few years after that's in place, because we have this 16 and some year vehicle turnover time, a few years after that's in place, we hit a very important threshold, and that's a threshold of some 15% of cars in our entire fleet, so 15% of cars on the road will allow fuel competition. Why is that an important threshold? It's an important threshold because if you own a fuel station that has 10 pumps, until you hit that 15% point of cars in your area that are fuel flexible, there's not a business case for you to either put in a new one that can serve something else or take one of your existing pumps and their underground storage and everything and retrofit it to serve something else, right? Okay. So we hit that 15% point a few years after the open fuel standard is put in place, and then we have stations that are putting in these pumps. Now, oil price is volatile. I think it's going to go up, but nothing goes up in a straight line. You know, it'll go up and down, but trend up all the time. So oil price is high. You're driving by this station. You see there's something else, you know, 87, 89, and if you're in Iowa, ethanol, if you're in Kentucky, methanol, if you're in, you know, Virginia, methanol probably, but you know, depending on where you are, depending on what makes sense for producers in your area. So anyway, you're seeing this fuel, you want to use it, your friend has a new car and can use this fuel and you can't. Okay, there's a need. Now, most people are not going to retrofit their own cars, right? But where there's a need, what you'll see is this. Entrepreneurs that own used car lots will start doing conversions because I can sell you a car that allows fuel choice, so that gives me a little bit of competitive edge. Or you can see companies like Midas and Meineke franchises saying, you know what, drive in the morning, drive out late afternoon or tomorrow, and we'll convert your car. So that's what it'll take. So the very key step here is first ensuring that the new cars are open to the fuel so that the market is open to the fuel so that companies like Exxon, see your question, let me talk about all sorts of good stuff. You know, when we think about the oil companies, we have to understand. Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell, etc., they're not the real big oil. They are not the real big oil. The real big oil is OPEC. So you said OPEC sits on 79% of world reserves, conventional. The international oil companies, the investor-owned oil companies, own 6% of world oil reserves. They have access to less than a quarter of world oil reserves. Now what we're seeing is, for the most part, because it's so hard for them to replace their oil reserves, they're more and more becoming natural gas companies. look at a 10, 15, 20-year horizon, that's the trend. So you ask yourself, well, Exxon doing a lot of natural gas. What would it take for Exxon to say, hey, there's a big market for that methanol? It would take cars being open to the fuel. And then all of this stuff can happen.
Of course, one of the things you can do is you can get a little app, especially if you live in Brazil and you're a cab driver, and you, depending on your particular motor or whatever, you just put the numbers in, and that decides what you fill up with when you go to the station. But I remember before that point, Brazilians were thrifty. They were of a thrifty mind. The same cab driver would turn off the engine and roll the cab up. I'm not sure American drivers are thrifty. We're not. We have a love affair with this gasoline motor, and I sometimes wonder if perhaps we aren't the villains. That we become wedded to certain issues of style and performance and various things, and in the midst of gasoline, we're not giving up the F-150s and all of these huge SUVs that you just don't see in, maybe a little in China, but you don't see in the rest of the world. So isn't there also a problem for your economic model to work that you need to have an intelligent agent? In other words, a more reasonable American driver and consumer of gasoline?
Okay, a lot of interesting points there. Let's start with this. Everybody be honest, please. How many of you have driven around the block or a few blocks down the road to get gasoline that's a little bit less expensive? Honesty, raise your hands. Okay. And it hasn't saved you $1 a gallon, right? It saved you maybe 5 or 10 cents, right? So on a 10-gallon fill-up, that's one thing. But I think the core of your point is very, very important. And the core of your point is, if what you are envisioning is an economic model, is relying on people to do something that they do not perceive as in their best interest, the likelihood of it happening approaches 0. Okay? So, you cannot, it's very difficult to ask people to compromise over the long term. Yes, when people feel at a time of war, and we are at war, but I think most people aren't necessarily in tune with that, but at a time of war, and our society has shown this, people are willing to compromise and do all sorts of things. But in general, over time, over the long haul, that's not how society works. So I think the thing to ask is, are we asking people to compromise here? Are we asking them to give up F-150s? Are we asking them to give up V6 engines? And I would say, no, fuel competition doesn't tell you give up your big car. It doesn't. First of all, if you think about liquid fuel choice, methanol was the fuel that the Indy 500 ran on. Alcohol is higher octane than gasoline, so it gives you more power. It's a racing fuel. So it's an octane enhancer. So it's not a compromise in terms of driving. The compromise is in terms of the fact that it has less energy per gallon than gasoline. So what that means is you save money per mile, but you need to refuel more often. And I would say this, you know what? If you are Larry Ellison or Sergey Brin, then the value of your time is very, very high, And unless there's some ideological factor that's driving you, you'll say, I'll fuel with the most energy-dense fuel because I don't want to spend time refueling. If you're making, I think, $40,000 a year or less, you're willing to refuel a lot more often, and we're not talking about vast amounts more often, okay? If you're willing to refuel more often in order to save money. And you can make that choice. Nobody's telling you fuel with something that's less energy dense if you don't want to. If you want to, fine. If you don't want to, don't. A car that enables fuel competition doesn't tell you which fuel to use. That's if we look at liquid fuel choice. If we look at electrified vehicles, you're not making a performance compromise at all. I had the very great pleasure of driving a Tesla. I like to drive. And I have to tell you, that was the most fun car I have ever driven. And the reason is, and one of the things that, I don't often do this, but I'm going to do this now. One of the things that most annoyed me during this campaign so far, there was one particular candidate who I know knows very, very well the importance of a fuel choice. I know he knows it very well. He understands everything that we talked about. And yet, he dared utter the sentence, "You can't put a gun rack on a Volt." Okay? And to me, that was incredibly infuriating. Because the purpose of a sentence like that, a Volt, of course, is the plug-in hybrid from GM. The purpose of a sentence like that, there's a reason I'm telling you all this. It's important to understand because we can't let this happen to us. The purpose of a sentence like that is to say some technologies, are manly men technologies, and some technologies are sissy technologies. And electrified vehicles, these are sissy cars. Now, I am all for arguing about particular policies, but when it comes to demonizing and sexualizing a particular technology in order to make it a culture war issue, I think this is utterly irresponsible. You can have a F-150 that's a plug-in hybrid. There's more room for the battery, and they're not making it, but there's no reason that they can't. The bigger the vehicle is, the more room there is for batteries. And you can put a gun rack on it. If you look at what the military's doing, they're putting gun racks on, it's prototype stage, but gun racks on electrified tactical vehicles. They're not gun racks, they're machine gun racks. So my point is, there's no compromise with this technology. The issue with electrification, with electrified vehicles, is that they're more expensive now. Presidential candidates should all hope that the cost comes down. But we can't allow them to do certain things, okay? Here's what we cannot, the list of what you should not tolerate from your representatives, from your senators, from people running for president. Do not tolerate it if they say we're very dependent on oil, it's a serious problem, let's build, on one side solar panels and wind turbines, on the other side nuclear power plants. Irrelevant. They know it's not true, they know one thing has nothing to do with the other, so if they're telling you that, call them on it. Second thing, it's fine to say let's drill more, it's fine to say let's increase efficiency. It's not fine to say these things in and of themselves are going to solve our problem. Now, this is something where you need to do education rather than confrontation, because I think this is something it's not obvious, okay? It's not obvious. But the education is the problem is that oil is a strategic commodity because it has a monopoly over transportation fuel. That monopoly is married to a cartel. We don't have the ability to bring antitrust action against the regimes that comprise this cartel, so we need to do something, and that something is to open our cars to fuel competition. That's the education point. But the third thing is, if they try to demonize a particular technology, not a policy, it's okay, for example, to say, it's very legitimate to say, I think technologies need to be able to stand on their own in the market. That's a very different thing than saying, this is a good technology because, you know, culture war reasons, and this one is beyond the pale. Very different. Don't let them go there. Sorry, had to get that off my chest.
Well, that's a great place to end. In fact, I think you just answered my question. Because my question was, you know, what should we do? What should we look at? We've got decisions to make this year. And how can we, as citizens here, influence our elected representatives to do the right thing? Where's all this going to end? Are we going in the right direction? And what do we need up there in Washington to help us push that in the right direction? I think you just answered that. And so, and thank you very much for sharing your time and coming down here from busy Washington, D.C. to F-150 country. We do have gun racks here. Except you can't get on base with them, not with a gun on them. But anyway, this is a great and a very influential part of the country, as you know. This is we've got the largest naval base in the world here, and some of the largest military facilities, and as well as we are very proud of our global economy that we do have here in Hampton Roads. As you know, we're the largest coal exporter in the world here in Hampton Roads. You'll probably see some of the ships out tonight over the Chesapeake Bay waiting to get coal put in them, because that seems to be a favorite place to park. But for your effort coming down, I do want to introduce you to another Virginia tradition. And we call it the traditional Jefferson Cup. And actually, I mentioned the tradition here in Lynn Haven Inlet and where the country really began right here. But another famous Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, when he had visitors to Monticello, and he treated them for dinner and an overnight and everything, he always gave them a gift on departing, and it was a Jefferson Cup. And it was meant to be a symbol of respect and friendship. And so for your trip here and for addressing our council, please accept our Jefferson Cup. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please have a seat. Okay. Well, we've got some other business to conduct tonight.